Hello and welcome again to Sport Unlocked podcast dissecting the week's sports news. I'm Rob Harris from the Associated Press, back from Paris, along with Tarek Panjan from the New York Times and Martin Ziegler from the Times, who was away from the mayhem of the Champions League final.
How you doing, guys? You're back from Paris. I hope you've recovered from your inadvertent tear gassing.
Yeah, nothing like the fans had encountered though. It was, I guess, being on the ground allowed us to report on one of the more unseemly incidents in football history again. Another troubled final.
Yeah, it was one where we were sort of scrambling, obviously, outside the stadium to just see what was going on, and you realise actually, particularly the Liverpool fans were desperate to tell us their accounts, to want us to document them, to get the message out, while potentially this game was still just about to be started on time. Obviously, it was delayed eventually, and for some of the geography of the whole thing, it all actually unfolded right next to the media entrance. So we were actually able to sort of go in and out, mainly because there was a lack of phone reception to sort of transmit things and then go back out to speak to the fans. But Tarek, we really encountered the issues at the stadium before even getting into the ground itself, on the outskirts. After we'd navigated the train strike issues, we were travelling with the fans. We were there more than 3 hours before kickoff, and then we had issues just getting into the outer perimeter into the stadium area, didn't we?
Rob and I travelled from the centre of Paris together by the RER train, like most of the fans would have done, and it would just seemed a little messy at that time. Lots of supporters, and not a lot of direction. I remember I even sent a text to my desk at about 6 o'clock to say it's really chaotic at the entrance. Obviously, not realizing that what was going to happen was going to happen. I think I said, looks like they didn't hire enough staff, just those big scary police. And what happened. And those big scary police really did not cover themselves in glory.
Because often at these events, we see a lot of stewards. There are all sorts of questions whether or not they should be unpaid, given the fact that they are working for an event that makes huge amounts of money. But they often are that reassuring, friendlier face with the foam fingers, pointing fans in the direction of where to go. But they were just not there at the Stade de France outside, were they?
It's interesting whether UEFA sort of blaming that on this was obviously this was arranged at short notice because they had to cancel the Champions League final in St. Petersburg because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I wonder if that's going to be blamed as a reason there weren't these sort of normal people on the ground.
Obviously, they still managed to get a lot of the hospitality facilities in place, not only at the stadium, but elsewhere in Paris. And actually, I noticed even when the game had kicked off late, there were still people holding those paddles that sort of direct VIP hospitality guests towards those areas.
When things happen to important people, that sometimes focuses the mind. And this, everyone was affected here. There's stories of the VIP buses being trapped for more than 2 hours for what was supposed to be a 90-minute journey, them having to walk 800 meters from the entrance they're supposed to be at. So I guess every stakeholder, be it fan, be it VIP, be it family and friends of players, media, everyone was affected by what happened on Saturday, and is able to provide testimony now as to what will go down as the most shambolic Champions League final in history.
And Martin, you would have been following it on television with some of the probably lack of clarity. You'd have heard the vague announcement about the game being delayed due to fans being late.
Yeah, obviously that was the first thing that came through. And then I was just like watching it on, seeing what you guys were tweeting. Actually, that was probably the best way of actually keeping in touch with the events that were happening on the ground. Is one of those things. Social media actually was very, very useful because it actually provided a much more accurate picture of what was taking place.
Yeah, and it has since then as well. But Rob, one thing I noticed when we were there was how indiscriminate some of the policing was, especially with the pepper spray. There were fans pretty much pressed against a fence, lining up. They're obviously frustrated and upset that they couldn't go to this game. The first Champions League final since the pandemic. You don't know if you're ever going to be in a game of this magnitude again. say the first Champions League final since the pandemic with a full house. And the one thing I noticed is that just the way they sprayed, it reminded me, when you're going into an airport through the duty free and there's someone with aftershave and they just want to spray it, they're just spraying it anywhere they like. It felt like that, but instead you're getting pepper spray or tear gas. It was just so random and so nonsensical.
That was my experience in 2016 at the Euros as well. Often you'd get these big lines of riot police standing in front of the fans and sort of almost using a moment to sort of attempt to disperse them by going in, and it seemed quite provocative almost from the policing side of things. And we're often judging risks when we're out there reporting in these scenarios, and for a lot of the time on Saturday night we were actually on the inner perimeter of the stadium, so we were on one side of the fence looking outwards, observing the fans still struggling to get in, the tear gas being fired off on the other side. It would just be floating back over. That's why we ended up getting sort of tear gas. But there were other times when they were firing rounds of tear gas from right next to me by the press entrance, just into open space, often to aim them at people who seem to be local youths who were attempting to get in, also running round. There was quite a bit of open space there. But it was the issue sort of directly on the turnstiles as well, where we would see the riot police standing there in quite a provocative, intimidating way, and that can obviously only heighten the tension around the place, particularly when they start just to fire the tear gas and the pepper sprays unleashed at such close range.
I mean, I think we've seen in France that the CRS police, the riot police, I mean, they're notorious for basically shooting tear gas first, asking questions later. I mean, do you remember the yellow vest protest movements fairly recently? I think even there was like anti-vax protests in France last year, and they just basically wade in, fire tear gas, and don't really care. And I just think when you start doing that in somewhere like around a football stadium where fans are sort of kettled in, space is limited and time is limited, then it creates serious problems, really does.
Well, the fans were at the heart of this and the frustration as well. And this is what some of them had to tell myself and Tarek in the queue as it was going on, as this chaos and disorder was unfolding outside the Stade de France on Saturday night.
Just trying to come to match with a legitimate ticket, and they can't get us in the stadium. That is a real ticket. My friend works for the club.
There were law-abiding citizens here 2 hours before the kickoff, here waiting. They shut every turnstile Liverpool related, not United.
Sean, you can adapt them.
That's all right.
Oh, go on.
But they shut all the all the Madrid sections were open, all the Liverpool sections were closed. Fans waited 2 hours, orderly, nothing out of order, and they were tear gassed, and all the sections were kept shut.
Did they tell you why it happened?
No direction, nothing from the streets. There were a lot of locals, French, trying to get in on the streets, but there was no direction where you get in. And we got up, and all the Liverpool sections were shut.
Bad organisation, because of stopping the station with the tickets, told to go up one place and then come to go back another place. Very, very poor for the game of this session.
How bad is it?
I say it's very bad.
I mean, what are you seeing?
What do I see? Queues, people not having any organisation.
And you mentioned some young people as well struggling.
The walls crying. Another possibility of like a Hillsborough where people get crushed. It's not this day and age.
Why are these crushes happening out there?
Because people can't get through.
Yeah, really, you see the frustration there and the fear as well for a lot of these supporters. There was also, I think the first time I've ever experienced this, the stadium was locked down once the game had started. No one could go in and no one could go out. I spoke to a policeman at half-time and a guy from UEFA, and they said, it is safer to be inside here for you than outside. There was a businessman from Australia who was trying to leave. They said to him he couldn't. There was an American man as well, American gentleman. He had some sort of emergency. He was told he couldn't go out. And part of this is to do with the local population. Saint-Denis, the stadium, for those unfamiliar with it, is in one of the most deprived neighbourhoods in all of France. And that created its own problems. And it made me think, when you're going to do this, if you're going to put a stadium up, you have to cater for the local community as well. You've basically brought the ritziest event in the world, potentially, or one of them, into their neighbourhood, and you're saying you're not invited to the party. And There's obviously there was a lot of muggings, there was assaults, all sorts of things, but I also think there should have been some consideration for that local population.
No, that's a good point. And then, of course, they're going to be having the Olympics there in a couple of years' time, and the Rugby World Cup.
So at full time, once Real Madrid had completed the victory over Liverpool, one of the things I did was went outside to see what was happening in terms of the entrances, and they'd been opened fully up to allow the Liverpool fans to leave. They were the ones closest to where we were. But it's a challenging situation what to do, because actually then you could have had locals flooding in. It was one thing noted in the English FA investigation into the disorder at the Euros final last year against Italy, that there were concerns if England had won, that would have created even greater problems post-match, because people would have tried to sort of surge into the stadium. And yet here was a wide open gate when we'd had all the issues pre-match that could have created anything, couldn't it?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, as a result of this, UEFA, I think that they sort of initially put a statement out which is reflecting the French government's position, which we know was basically blaming the fans and not taking any responsibility themselves for the police action. So, and the UEFA sort of reflected that with their statement on Saturday night, saying it was all due to thousands of fake tickets. I think since then they've sort of basically been forced into an independent investigation. But interesting to see Liverpool this week are sort of they've sent a list of 13 questions to UEFA about asking for more information about the review, and one of the points is they want to know why the Portuguese MP Dr. Tiago Rodrigues has been selected, and whether he has any links to UEFA. So I mean, I think there's certainly going to be scrutiny on this investigation too.
It depends what one wants to look at in terms of links. Is he familiar to UEFA? Yes. When UEFA had to move the Champions League finals during the pandemic, Portugal was their venue of choice. First in Lisbon for that 8-team tournament, and then the Manchester City versus Chelsea final in Porto. One of the government officials they had to liaise with is this gentleman. So he is a known quantity to UEFA. And again, it just not saying he's not going to do the work properly, but it's important that everyone knows what the relationships are, given what's at stake here.
Obviously, it's often a balancing act in this situation, getting someone independent, but also someone who might understand the issues. And perhaps maybe if we'd had more crowd control expertise on the panel, maybe we'll get the full lineup at some point. That would actually help.
Yeah, and it's going to be a number of months as well, guys. UEFA point out that the FA inquiry after Euro 2020, I think, took about 3 months, and it may take that long, or if not a little bit longer, to get to the answers that the world is waiting for here. And Liverpool, Martin, you mentioned, they're furious, aren't they? With the French politicians more than anyone else, it seems like.
Yeah, of course, because it was the French politicians who are sort of blaming the Liverpool fans, who there's obviously lots of echoes of that 1989 disaster at Hillsborough, where Liverpool fans were completely unfairly blamed for the terrible tragedy which led to 96 people dying.
And that's the whole thing that we're seeing here in terms of the fears of a cover-up. And I was at the French Sports Ministry on Monday when the Sports Minister and the Interior Minister appeared. It was chaotic. It was in this small room, everyone crammed in, no proper order in terms of determining how to ask questions. You had to shout them out. And, amongst the things I was asking about was just, when did they expect fans to turn up, given the fact they're saying they arrived there late, when in fact they were queuing for such long periods? And I was also trying to speak to the Sports Minister on the way out to ask her just why were they tear gassing the fans, and there was no answer from that, and they've been a bit vague since then. But one of the key points is the fact they're saying there was 30 to 40,000 fake tickets or ticketless fans who tried to get their way in. So we've had no breakdown in terms of what that is necessarily from them, but we do get the word that we've gathered in reporting that there were fewer than 3,000 fake tickets that were actually seen to be clocked actually at the stadium itself, yes, which is far removed from the 40,000 figure.
2,589 to be exact in terms of the numbers that were intercepted or caught there at the gate, and that is that is a significant number, but it isn't in those in the scale that the French government ministers are trying to say. But it also raises a question, guys. What happened to 30 or 40,000 people? Did they just disperse? And in the inquiry, I know they were asked by ministers, were there helicopters? There were. We saw them. There were helicopters circling. So there must be images of 30 or 40,000 people leaving. And no one has broadcast that, and no one has talked about this.
No, that's a good point. I thought that too, actually. That figure. I mean, I still think 2,500 is a lot.
That is a lot. I think, Martin, it's about 3 times what an average Champions League final might have. They do expect fake tickets, and I think 1,000 is normally the mark. And the other thing that I heard was there may have been 4,000 people in that stadium who should not have been. And I think we've seen videos of mainly French youths clambering, climbing, crawling under turnstiles, getting into the stadium. And then there's video imagery of that as well. That's quite a lot of people as well, isn't it? 4,000 extra people inside the stadium.
And you could hear the Liverpool fans shouting, "Get down," at those people who were trying to scale the fences to get into the stadium. Well, let's bring into the conversation now the Executive Director of Football Supporters Europe, Ronan Evan. Welcome to Sport Unlocked, Ronan.
Thanks. Happy to be with you guys.
So give us a flavour. What's the week been like? Have you been in and out of talks, meetings, as this narrative has been changing and challenged by the French government?
Yeah, well, with my colleague Pierre, we were accredited observers on that game. So we spent 3 hours at the entrances, at the gates. We've been pretty comfortable from the beginning, challenging the narrative of the government. Now, it's not every day as fan representative that we get to do that and to somehow change the perception or take part in changing the perception of the events on Saturday. So it's been a very busy week, but we still haven't heard anything from obviously our own public authorities. We're French, so we thought at some point our own government will reach out to us, but that still hasn't happened.
The one thing as an observer there, Rob and I were at the stadium as well. We spoke to you during the game. I met you at half time as well, I think. The dress of these police, they look like they're tooled up with sprays, with batons, with shields. Even before any of this, they look ready to be aggressive. Why is that in France? It's not the same. Rob and I were at Wembley this week as well for a different game, and the policing just looked different. What is it about France?
Well, they're dressed to impress. I think it was a show of force. That's what it was. You know, the Prefecture de Police of Paris was gearing up to welcome what some of the Liverpool fans were 35 or 40 years ago. That's precisely what happened. You know, the whole narrative, the communication from the police in the week ahead of the final was all about how much of a risk game that was and how much they had to, you know, manage this risk and manage this crowd by putting it in a park in the fan zone and then make sure whatever happens, they never come across Madrid fans. And obviously that's a ridiculous claim when you know that everything went fine in Kiev in 2018 between Real Madrid and Liverpool fan, and the same in Madrid in 2019 when Liverpool played Tottenham. So I think they confuse two things, which is on one hand dealing with risk fans, and on the other hosting a really large fan base in Paris, and those are completely different matters. So that explains why there was such a show of force at the stadium with, as you said, fully geared up riot police vans parked everywhere, and they were clearly meant to be seen. You know, they were next to wherever fans had to pass by to go to the stadium. And in the end, they were perceived as a threat, and then that's why the government refuses now to see them as victims. It's a bit of a dehumanizing process. You know, if they were a threat at the beginning, before the game, they can't really be a victims after the game, and that tells a lot about the lack of intelligence that was used in the preparation of this game, the completely archaic police operations around football in France, and the way, we are generally seen as a threat, as the enemy, and that's something we see all across the board in the way the French police work around football in general.
And that was the sense that they were sort of dressed as riot police, and it might surprise some people. We've had the Platinum Jubilee celebrations in London, hundreds of thousands around the streets, no obvious sign even of armed police, let alone riot police. And one thing that was notable, obviously, at the Stade de France was the indiscriminate use of tear gas and pepper spray, sometimes right in the face of fans who didn't seem to be overly hostile.
Yeah, and we're talking about a very diverse crowd in terms of there were families, there were elderly people, there were vulnerable people in this crowd. And it was completely indiscriminate. This is not unusual for France. It actually went worse in the last few years, in the last 5 to 7 years. It's been used as just a way to calm down people. And I know that's not what I think, but that's sometimes what the police seems to think. Just a person protesting that they've been waiting outside for 2 hours was enough to get pepper sprayed at the Stade de France last Saturday. And that shows the police that is incapable of dealing with emotions and with a crowd and of de-escalating. So in the end, they created more problem that they solved. When Darmanin, the French Ministry of Interior, says the police saved lives on Saturday, that's the exact opposite. The most dangerous place on Saturday, in my opinion, was this bottleneck around the access to the stadium for Liverpool fans coming from the suburb train D, the RER D. And there, the police hasn't saved lives. Their failed operations could have killed people if it wasn't for the general calmness and fantastic self-policing of the Liverpool fans.
Do you think there's a sort of wider issue here, not just this Champions League final? I mean, I spoke to people who'd been at the Europa League final in Seville. So there are big problems there, not quite as bad, but still big problems. And then other people say that there's a sort of generally a lot of these UEFA club finals are not great. Does the whole sort of organisation need looking at?
Well, yeah, it was tough here. Sevilla wasn't great at all. There was massive problem with the police at the entrances and how much personal items, sunglasses, sunscreen, hand sanitizer, AirPods, medicines, tampons. This was the kind of stuff that were confiscated at the entrance of the stadium. That was a massive problem, and of course there was no drinkable water in the stadium 1 hour before kickoff. So that was a really bad final in that regard. This year, Tirana, which everybody expected to be complicated, was the best final, at least the best men's final. Turin was okay as well. I think what it says here is that there's probably needs for UEFA to look more into how they award the competitions. It's not just about being able to provide a good stadium and being able to cater for sponsors and media and so on. It's also about how much the public authorities of the countries are able to host fans, and in the end, how much the police is able to commit to a specific process to set up. And both in Madrid, in Sevilla and Paris, what we've seen in the end is a local police incapable of delivering what they were committed to do.
Yeah, it's incredible that you have people having AirPods taken. I mean, I heard that as well from a colleague of mine who was there as a fan. But yeah, I mean, that's like £150 just confiscated, as well as other things as well.
Yeah, and some dangerous stuff, like, I don't know, I'm not sure how it's called in English. The pen that people with diabetes have to use to check the diabetes level. Tablets.
Ronan, what did you make of the comments from the two government ministers, the Interior Minister and the Sports Minister, given what we saw on the ground? And their comments seem not to bear any resemblance to any observed reality.
I think the reason why they decided to lie, first of all, they were fed wrong information by the police. I think this is now pretty clear. That was on match day, before even the actual kickoff. Then they made this insane decision to tweet and to blame English fans without having any sort of proof of what they were claiming. And then they went on with this lie. So I think we have parliamentary elections in 10 days now. 2 weeks between the final and the parliamentary elections. And I think the political decision that Darmanin made is to choose a diplomatic crisis or whatever with the UK over a domestic crisis. And in the end, they get both, which is really absurd. On top of it, they have decided to put the blame So they've decided to put the blame on the English fans because we are considered as second-class citizens in France by the police, by the public authorities, and often, to be honest, by the media. And that's also that shows why international media and British media have been much faster to understand the scope of what happened at the Stade de France than some of our own medias in France. So blaming it on the fans, they probably thought that was pretty easy, and they didn't understand that the backlash would be what it was. And the final factor, and it's a fantastic political mistake, is that they didn't want to acknowledge that there were a group of young people around from the districts around the stadiums that actually tried to get in. So that was a fantastic present to the far right. They're really enjoying it now, because now they say, "Oh, you blame the good English people because you're too afraid to blame your own young men from deprived district and migrants because a number of the people that were arrested are not French citizens." So obviously the far right is loving this, the right is loving this. That now it's a full-scale political crisis. So that was a really, really stupid move. The Senate hearings, they were pretty interesting, and knowing my own country, that's our only hope to get some sort of transparent response to what happened on Saturday, because the police is very much used to deal with those matters internally. If you look at the Euro 2016, which on an organizational and security point of view wasn't a success, no matter what the French are saying, a few heads have rolled after Euros in the 4-6 months after the Euros, but that was all done very silently and without a proper assessment of what happened. So that's why we find again 6 years later the same outdated police operation at the Stade de France, because we've never discussed it. No one outside of the police was ever given a chance to give an input, and that's a natural tendency of the police, of the Préfecture de Police, of the Ministry of Interior, and thankfully there is an interest now from the Senate, so we might get some responses there.
It's obviously separate from this, but this was a week when we also saw further crowd disorder in French domestic football. The Saint-Etienne fans throwing projectiles on the pitch after losing that relegation playoff against Auxerre. The season started with issues between Marseille, Nice, and other instances throughout the season. Given the poor behaviour of some French fans, can you see why there is that concern amongst the government and why they might try to shift the blame onto fans as a collective, given the fact that France hasn't got its own house in order this season?
No, France certainly doesn't have its own house in order. But what has happened at the beginning of the season was a crisis. It was temporary. Things went back to normal. It had to do with the return to the stadium, with some dynamics in the fan groups that I'm not the best to comment on because I'm not a sociologist and anthropologist. It had to do with the loss of experience in the clubs, in the police. No one really knew how to police a game anymore. This stopped by itself after a few months. It wasn't because of a reaction from the government or the police. It just naturally died. And then there's this incident in Saint-Etienne. Those two are not necessarily connected because the rest of the season has been relatively normal. Now, what happened in Saint-Etienne, that's a local crisis. It has to do with local issues. But what we have in common between the final in Saint-Denis and what happened in Saint-Etienne is just that we have a police that is generally not very good at policing football games. We're in a country where regularly, every weekend, we have administrative orders banning fans from traveling from point A to point B, which is, in our opinion as fans, an unacceptable limitation of the freedom of movement. But it's also those banning orders, it's the public authorities saying, sorry, we don't know how to police 100 fans of Dijon, so we have to ban them from traveling. And then there's a paradox when the same country then decides to host the Champions League final, the biggest club competitions game of the year. So then that bears the question, I don't necessarily have the answer, but is France really capable of hosting such games when, again, the public authorities are telling us we don't know how to police a second division game?
One thing that's come up over the last week is why did this seem to affect Liverpool fans more than Real Madrid fans, although we started to hear testimony from the Spanish fans as well. What is it you've managed to assess on that? And is that something you've noted? And you've seen an attempt to sort of try to almost characterise no issues at all amongst the Real Madrid fans to stigmatise the Liverpool fans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from the moment they went on this narrative that the English fans were to blame and used these old stigma prejudices towards Liverpool fans, they had to somehow praise Real Madrid fans. It went to the point when the Ministry of Sport started to praise Real Madrid for being a super well organized, almost a perfect club. This is from the same government that opposed the Super League a year ago, and now they're praising one of the renegades for being well organized, doing everything they can in terms of fan dialogue. In terms of fan dialogue, Real Madrid is a terrible club. They don't speak to their fans. They mostly see them as cash cows. So it's a really weird thing to say that Real Madrid is now a good practice example. But what we know is really different. There were giant queues on the Real Madrid side as well, and there were not necessarily anyone without tickets on that side because the entry that was breached was on the other side. So there must have been difficulties with the scanning of the ticket as well, one way or another. But when at the time of the original kickoff, there were still hundreds of Madrid fans outside the stadium. But yeah, the government decided just to ignore it. So then it's the power of the social networks where people are posting videos of themselves waiting at the gates past kickoff time. And then now we see more and more media interest onto the Madrid side of the story as well. There's another interesting thing. The government is blaming Liverpool fans for coming in too big numbers and Real Madrid for coming with just people with tickets. Obviously, there's a different fan culture on both sides. But it's absurd for if you host a Champions League final, you want people to visit your country and to spend money in bars, in restaurants, in hotels. So that's a really weird thing to say, especially after 2 years of COVID. Oh, sorry, that's all on Liverpool's side because 45,000 people decided to visit more people decided to visit our city than planned.
We've now got this UEFA review underway. What are the recommendations you would like to see from it that would impact the policing, the security around future European final venues, games in general run by UEFA, what's needed outside, what's needed in actually choosing the venue, particularly when in many countries, UEFA won't be able to have influence to dictate to the police how they act?
The review is the first step into the right direction. We have guarantees that we'll be involved together with supporters groups of the both clubs, so that at least that's better than what we get on the French side for the moment. Again, it's about who gets to organize the competition. That's a much broader problem. It's about the size of the stadiums. It's about the capacity of the countries to host them. It's about the human rights requirement that should be in place when you award a tournament. They're in place for the Euros, not necessarily for the European club competitions finals. So, I think if there's one thing we learned from Sevilla and Paris is that you can't go to a country where the police can't let it go and want to control everything, because you end up in a situation like this where fans are not being hosted properly. They are being treated as a threat. They're being funneled into the stadium, and no one really cares the way things go. And if this is the biggest game of the season, there has to be a lot more scrutiny on who gets to host it and whether the host country is serious about hosting fans properly.
Ronan, thanks very much for joining us on Sport Unlocked.
Thank you.
Ronan Evan there from Football Supporters Europe. Well, the Champions League final wasn't the only big event in Paris over the last week. There's also the French Open at Roland Garros. And talking about issues with fans and how much fans are taken into consideration, and players, in fact, indeed, because it was only 8:30 on Monday night when they finally started the match between Djokovic and Nadal, probably knowing it would take some time. And was it past 2 a.m. it finished? It was near 2 a.m., wasn't it, that it finished in the end?
It was past 2 a.m., yeah.
And all I've seen was accounts of people struggling to get away from Roland Garros, struggling to get taxis, quite similar to our experience at the Stade de France on Saturday night. So not only not taking the players into consideration, but also spectators as well locally.
Have we had any word at all as to why the scheduling works like that at Roland Garros? Or again, it's another example of match-going supporters or people who like to see sport in person being the last people that organisers want to think about. But given that they probably think most of the money is coming from broadcasters, and I think we see it across a range of sports, particularly in football. But here, I'd love to know why this has happened.
Well, Nadal said that he wasn't too complaining because he had 2 days off after that, but he said he understands as well that the thing is, television pays a lot of money to have matches that late, so that's why it happens, and that's how the players do make their money. But he also said that they still need to try and find the right balance in terms of ensuring they aren't playing so late.
Yeah, there's an interesting side issue with these sort of late starts, in which the French Open tournament director Amélie Mauresmo, the former professional tennis player herself, she made a sort of remarkable statement that most of the primetime nighttime matches were being put on were men's singles finals, because she said she was struggling to find a women's pairing that had this sort of similar star power. A lot of female players very upset about that, and she was then forced to apologise. But it does seem, I think, something like of the 10 night sessions, there was only one women's match scheduled for that, which clearly is in this day and age, you'd think that was a very, very strange decision for organisers to make, especially someone like her.
I think at Wimbledon, you two probably visit Wimbledon a lot more than I do, but I think they alternate matches between the genders on centre court. And I think that's been in place for a while.
Yeah, it's much more equal, that sort of division at Wimbledon. Obviously, they still play fewer sets at women's tennis. But yeah, in terms of that sort of match-up, that sort of pairing, it is much more equal.
And the data actually shows from this year's French Open that more often than not, it is the female players who are kicking things off at Roland Garros, because that's when audiences are actually lower and the men are getting those key prime time slots. The WTA say there is room for improvement, and if we want to build the value of our combined product, then a balanced match schedule is critical in providing that pathway. French Open coming to a conclusion as we record this episode. Well, back in the world of football, it's award season, and Tarek, some intriguing news actually from the Professional Footballers Association awards in England.
It's concerning the women's awards, and again, the women's professional game is in sort of that growth phase, and we're still getting familiar with a lot of the professionals, and it seems some of their teammates are as well. Because one thing that caught my eye in the PFA Women's Young Player of the Year category, this is in England, the Chelsea Lauren James was nominated for the award. And I think I found it surprising because she'd only played 107 minutes of actual football this season. I was wondering how and why that would happen. And we talked about it for the FIFA awards as well a while back, where some of the names you think should have been there were not there. And then the more famous players who haven't really performed well or were even injured this year were put on a short list. It just shows, I don't know, the game is still in that growth phase.
Yeah, we saw it at FIFA when Marta would often be the award winner at the FIFA ceremonies, despite perhaps having less impact that season. We see with Lauren James in this case, she has had an injury challenge season. Yet this is the award voted by her fellow professionals. They should be the one watching the games. FIFA have changed their system, so there are, voters who are actually watching the women's game. It seems more actually voting on that now, but it does show some flaw in the system here, doesn't it?
But I somebody pointed out, which on social media, which I thought was quite interesting, that, for example, Shannon O'Brien, who plays for Leicester women's team, named Leicester's Player of the Year, started every game, had a great season. She wasn't even shortlisted, so it's definitely some sort of big club bias at the very least.
Yeah, and Martin, at the FIFA level as well, there was Megan Rapinoe, obviously the world famous American player and activist as well. I think it's fair to say she actually said she was shocked to find herself selected for the 2020 World 11, saying she'd hardly played. The awards were in, I think, December of 2020, and she hadn't played football for 7 months. So again, it seems a little bit of a popularity contest at times rather than a football contest.
Well, a boost for the women's game this week globally, actually, because we had the debut of the Finalissima, the meeting of the European and South American champions at Wembley, this partnership between UEFA and CONMEBOL, seemingly to challenge the power of FIFA. And after the game, they've decided there will be a women's version. So the winners of the Copa America Women's Edition and the Women's Euros this year are going to meet at a game in Europe at some point. So create, as I think we see particularly around the women's game, yet more bigger international fixtures, because it does seem actually in the women's game the international scene is actually the dominant one at times.
Very much so. Not at times. I think in the women's game, the international scene is the scene. Those tournaments get huge amounts of attention. They are getting packed stadiums. They are excellent tournaments. So I think it's a good idea, and perhaps that's where the growth might be in the women's game.
And we did have a quieter experience at the second game we were both at this week at Wembley compared to Paris, because we were there on Wednesday night to see the first edition of this Finalissima, with Argentina beating Italy 3-0. And in London during the day, there were seemingly Argentina fans everywhere, and the atmosphere was absolutely huge in the stadium. You wouldn't know this was a game, an event that hadn't existed before, and the fact a trophy that was only being handed out for the first time.
Yeah, it to me it was a fabulous event, and again, sensible ticket pricing, some as low as £30. So what's that? $50. We had fans from all over the world. Really, a lot of Argentines, tens of thousands of Argentines from across Europe and living in the UK. There, great atmosphere. Locals from around the Wembley area, northwest London. There was a lot of people there, and actually, Argentina produced a strong showing. We had Messi on top form with those 2 assists. The crowd loved it. It was a great night, and without any of the trouble we discussed earlier, it was just a fun evening.
So this sounds like we're talking about our experiences on the road, travelling to games away from Martin this week.
Martin, you've actually been playing a bit of football this week, haven't you?
I play every week, but yeah, you know what? I nearly had I don't score many, but I'd scored one header and one with my left foot, and I thought this is going to be my opportunity to score the perfect hat trick, and pulled my calf muscle. I had to go in goal.
Is that where you were striking for that third for the hat trick? Was that like a
No, stretching to intercept a ball, and and ended up in a crumpled heap.
There'll be other hat tricks, Martin. There'll be other moments. Don't worry. Rob, football-wise, there was some business news as well from Italy.
Yeah, takeover of the Italian champions, fresh from AC Milan, winning the title for the first time in 11 years. They've been sold by Elliott Management to Red Bird in a deal that has made a huge amount of return investment from Elliott, given the fact they did pick up this distress asset, and they get to keep a minority stake to as well, don't they?
Hot on the heels of this Chelsea deal that the American group, Todd Bowley, Clear Lake, $2.5 billion for Chelsea. Again, a cash pit, losing a whole lot of money, Chelsea. $1.6 billion in the Roman Abramovich era. AC Milan, valued at $1.2 billion, lost $98 million in the last published results, nearly $200 million the year before. Again, doesn't own its stadium, needs to build a stadium, plays in Italy with Serie A with all of its problems. I'm just struggling to see how this 1.2 billion has come from, and great for Elliott. And just to remind people how they picked that club up, the team was owned by a Chinese businessman that no one had heard of, a guy called Li Yonhong, and he had bought the club for about 700 million euros from Silvio Berlusconi and borrowed 300 million from Elliott, contingent borrowed 300 million euros from Elliott, the Vulture Fund, and that was all against their stake in the club. They defaulted, so essentially Elliott got AC Milan for 300 million euros, and now, they're saying it's worth 1.2 billion.
I mean, that's a lot of money when you look at the sort of the projection of Serie A, their media rights and things like that. But I suppose it's a great name, isn't it, AC Milan? So maybe the good times can come back and the money can start rolling in from somewhere.
Well, I've got a question for both of you then. Do you think, so with these American guys, the ones who come to Chelsea and these guys here, will the money come in, or are they thinking Super League or something major is going to happen for these big brand names? That's what they're buying. They're buying Chelsea, one of the Super League clubs, buying AC Milan, another one of the Super League clubs. Do you think they're projecting and taking a gamble here?
Well, certainly hoping that the Champions League, that's already getting bigger from 2024, gains an even greater foothold with the new Swiss system format that allows for even more games, and more games are added on between the very best at the very least, even if there isn't a Super League in the years to come.
That may be as simple as that. You're right. I mean, but there are Americans who've suffered from their involvement in football before, haven't they? I mean, there's Randy Lerner who owned Aston Villa for 10 years, and he lost £200 million from his investment, and he described football as sports Wild West, where frauds and charlatans are allowed to roam freely.
Sounds quite accurate when you say. There was also Ellis Short there at Sunderland as well, lost a huge amount of money.
Well, one place where cash seems aplenty for sport is Saudi Arabia, and next week we see the first of the series of the Saudi-backed Rebel Golf Series, the LIV Golf, which is starting at Centurion Club in St Albans, which is just north of London, and we actually do have the names of 42 golfers who have been announced who will be competing. You know, there isn't Rory McIlroy, Tiger Woods, any of the big names like that, but there are still some very significant names who will be taking part. We've got Ian Poulter, Sergio Garcia, Lee Westwood, Graham McDowell, and we're still waiting word from the PGA in terms of what repercussions there will be for these players competing.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest surprise was to see Dustin Johnson's name on that list, because the former world number one, he told the PGA in February that he's going to not make that switch. You know, the PGA had said they're going to bring a bunch of penalties and threaten people with all sorts of things if they take part. So you wonder what made Dustin Johnson change his mind and join this cash-soaked Saudi project.
What first attracted Dustin Johnson to the multi-$100 million Saudi golf project?
It's a real mystery. It's a real mystery, Six.
Yeah, a $25 million total prize money for each of these events, $4 million for the winner, and around $120,000 just for the last place player. So I wonder why they want to compete.
Speaking of large sums from Saudi Arabia, guess who's going back there, Martin?
Eddie Howe?
Well, Eddie is a clue.
It's Eddie Hearn in the world of boxing.
Quite right. What's the latest, Rob?
Yeah, Joshua's due to have his rematch with Alexander Usyk in Jeddah in August. It's going to be pretty hot there, isn't it, in the height of summer?
Well, yeah. Well, I guess it must be indoors if it's going to be at that time of year, isn't it? Surely.
Although they might have learnt from the Qataris how to air condition their stadiums, and they're not short of a few bob, so they're going to make these guys as comfortable as possible. And throw a lot of money their way. Usyk's interesting as well, because he, at the start of the Ukraine war, was on the front lines there. He was part of a defence force for Ukraine, and as part of Ukraine's government's efforts to use its sports people to tell the world about Ukraine and the suffering there. He's been given the dispensation to leave the country and train for this fight, like the football players we've seen in recent months.
Yeah, the Ukrainians still on the path to the World Cup after that victory over Scotland, and now they're on to Wales to play the playoff final, and certainly a real source of inspiration back home. Even some of the pubs managed to sort of stay open in Kyiv. There was one in particular, one of my colleagues was at that. I think as long as you stayed there all through the night and left when curfew was lifted, you could go and watch the game there. So an all-nighter was a requirement.
Just about every neutral will be hoping Ukraine make it through. That's unfortunate for Wales, but I'm sure like the Scots, if Ukraine win, then the Scots gave them a really good show.
And still the Intercontinental playoffs to come this month in Qatar for those final World Cup spots. Well, that about brings an end to this episode of Sport Unlocked. Thank you to Ronan Evan earlier. For myself, Rob Harrison, Martin Ziegler, Tariq Panja, thank you as ever for listening. If you've got any feedback, you can message us at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. But for now, enjoy the sport in the days ahead. Goodbye.